in language learning, there are about four different types of activities. We have reading, we got writing, we got listening, and we got speaking. Usually, when it comes to learning words, there's a bunch of things that you have to consider, okay? Because everyone usually assumes that words is just one overall category, but in reality, there's like multiple stuff within words, multiple categories. For example, there's active and passive vocabulary. And we'll just assume in most cases when people say they struggle about learning words, okay, they probably assuming to learn active words, but in reality, it's first you have to learn the pass words passively, and then later you convert that to active. So that's a two-step process. Now the real question is, how can you learn enough passive vocabulary? Because okay, the difference between passive and active is that passive is when you're able to read or when you listen to it, you understand it. That's known as a passive vocabulary. If you know, like, if you understand certain words within a sentence, when you read it or you listen to it, they're your passive vocabulary within those categories. So reading and listening for passive is a whole separate category. But when it comes to active vocabulary, that's where people want to understand. So basically, in this video, we're pretty much going to emphasize on the passive vocabulary and the realities of learning the passive vocabulary. So the first thing that you have to know is that the brain is automatically trained to focus on the most important words and discard everything that is considered not useful at all. And this is a problem because the brain's only objective is survival. And in this case, if you're going to try to learn certain words that you think are important, you're going to have to be more strategic about your approach, that you are allowed to let your brain to adapt and tell it that you need to learn all these certain words, that because certain content that you want to listen to, you need those words. Okay. The first problem is that you're always going to forget and you're always going to relearn, because in our native language, even in our native language, when we're young, we're always forgetting words and we're always learning it. Like you learn concepts like biology and all the hard topics. You'll forget it and then you learn it and then it's more solidified. Okay. When it comes to foreign languages, every time you were to look up a new word, okay, an average person in the past would look up through a dictionary. And if you doing like a translation, okay, it takes about 1 or 2 minutes. Just look into a physical dictionary, get the translation, close the book, and you forget. Okay, that's what the brain is trained to do. You're automatically gonna learn and forget, and you learn because, for example, that's what Anki is designed for. Is that every time you were to create a card, and then that card will come once again whenever the system thinks that you adapted to the word and you learned it. Okay, now because now we're in modern technology, the modern era, the objective is to find a system that lets you translate as fast as physically possible and get the most outcome out of it. Okay, like for example, there's Link, there's Lingo, there's other applications that we instantly click on the word, then you get instant translation. And I have a really good analogy for learning passive vocabulary. This is a topic, learning passive vocabulary in a reading context. Because if your objective is to physically do everything like read, speak, and listen, okay, that's actually a bit harder. But in this context, the context is your goal is to speak and listen and understand native speakers, and that reading isn't really a priority. Okay, because when it comes to words, you only need to learn the minimum requirements for the word. And for example, if you were to learn certain words like Mandarin Chinese, for example, you don't really need to know the full definition all the way around, sideways, forward, backwards, anything like that. Your only objective is to get the idea what the word is, so that, for example, when you have to convert that word into listening, then you're going to have to, that's a whole separate task. Making the word to a listening comprehension is a different step process. So basically, when you read it in a subtitle and you see that word again, as long as you can see that word and get the idea and you can link the message with the sound and the meaning, then your chances of actually acquiring that word in the listening context is faster, okay? Because if you're holding yourself back to get to know the word 100%, that'll slow you down, which is fine. The best analogy I have is that if you were to make a new friend, okay, learning words is the same thing as making new friends. when you meet a person for the first time, you have no idea who they are, okay, and you don't know their name. That name is equivalent to a translation. If you ask them, "Nice to meet you. What's your name?" and they tell you names like Miguel. Okay, Miguel is a physical translation link between your language and the foreign language, and that's pretty important because without that translation, your neurons can't create. You can't create neurons to actually allow your brain to make the connection. Okay, acquisition in the acquisition context, and then because after that you have to consider, can you, when you see this person the first time, are you really going to remember their name on the first try? If you do, they made a really good impact in you, a good first impression. Because words, when it comes to words, it doesn't really give us a good impression. You might have a favorite word, but that's about it. In reality, for average person, you meet that person, learn their name, and then you forget because, for example, you meet them next time, the word is actually easier. Okay, as in you remember their name a lot easier in this context. For example, okay, okay, first time, okay, your name's Miguel. Okay, like a week later, you forgot their name. Okay, and he asked him again, "Sorry, I forget your name. What was it again?" Miguel. Okay, what is happening is that your brain is prioritizing the word as the word is a the word is of importance, and that will more and more give you more acquisition to remember that person's name because you're combining like the physical. Okay, you're picturing them. You get the physical body. That's the image part of it, and you get the actual name. That's the translation. Translate to your language. Your objective is to, with that analogy, make about 10 to 30,000 friends, and that's the same equivalent of learning words and language learning. This is only for the topic of language learning of passive vocabulary in a reading context. Listening is a whole different story. It's a whole separate category. Okay, you have 4 categories, and we're targeting just the reading aspect. But to read, you need the words, and you split the words into categories. You have passive and you have active vocabulary. So the first thing is that you want to see the words multiple times in different contexts. You want to see the word, get instant translation, and let it go. Because that is equivalent to asking a person what is their name, and then you leave it alone because the brain requires 5 to 32 times around there to actually know what the word is fully, okay? And because of that, it's going to take you a while. And for example, there's lots of people that say that you need exposure to the language. This is the context of exposure, is that you have to be within a context in many different scenarios of seeing that same word, and then you will learn that word in a more acquisitional way because acquisitional is more subconscious. And because when people think that I need, okay, 5 to 32 times, what counts as one time, 2 times? Okay, if you see the same word in a paragraph, you see, like, for example, I, and you see I again, my opinion, it does not count because your brain is already prepared and adapted. You have to put it in a novelty scenario that this is a new scenario. It's trained for survival, and that is when it's going to start learning and create neurons. Okay, you might see I like in 5 different articles. That will automatically happen. You'll learn the word when you wake up because sleep is technically when it gets all the data processed within the time of you studying. Because the true process of language learning is when you're sleeping because all the hard work throughout the day, and then the results is when you wake up the next morning. And that is pretty much the truth about language learning when it comes to learning words, passive vocabulary. Okay, you're going to forget and you will relearn it. That's why you need a system that can help you relearn and translate as fast as physically possible in a way that your brain doesn't need to work as hard. It just has to see it. That's what exposure means in this context. All right. If this is useful and there's any questions, please leave in the comments. Appreciate your time. Thank you very much.